Well, thank you all for joining us today on the Grow Our Vote panel. This is part of our Green Tie web series. And in case you don't know, first of all, we appreciate you taking the time to learn more about CVI's work. But if you haven't yet, don't forget to head over to the event page at cvidaho.com/green tie to get all the details on Green Tie, including all the webinars that we're having. We also have some fun content for folks to engage in. And so be sure to check that out. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are sitting here on ancestral homelands of the Native nations, including the Boise Valley people, the Shoshone Bannock and Shoshone Paiute tribes, as well as, of course, the Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai, and Nez Perce tribes. Although I'm not Native American, I would really like to just acknowledge that. And also for this panel, I think it's going to help us set the tone for the conversation, because really what we're hoping to talk about is underrepresentation, demystifying communities of color, in this case, Latinx community, and also talk about the CVI's voting rights program. And for this panel, we have an incredible set of folks joining us today. I'm gonna be introducing them from my left to right. And so first of all, we have JJ Saldana. JJ Saldana has held many positions throughout his illustrious career, including a position at the Idaho Department of Education as an L Advisory Committee member, the Boise Chief of Police Advisory Council, the Hispanic Cultural Center of Idaho Board, Council of Student Affairs for the Idaho State Board of Education, the Idaho Department of Education Migrant Advisory Committee. He and Rebecca here, who is to my direct left, were co-hosts of the Latino podcast radio show, the Latino Card. He is part of the Idaho Immigrant Resource Alliance, Visión 2C, Image de Idaho, Idaho Civic Engagement Board, Idaho Hispanic Youth Leadership Summit co-founder, Animo Media Awards founder, and he currently serves as the Community Resource and Development Specialist for the Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs. So please join me in welcoming JJ. We can do a light clap. Next, we have, Kathy Griesmyer here. Kathy joined the city of Boise in 2020 and currently serves as the Government Affairs Director, where she represents the city and state and state legislator in Congress, where she represents the city at the state legislature in Congress. Sorry for that. Prior to her position to the city, Kathy worked at the American Civil Liberties Union of Idaho, where she served as the policy director and chief lobbyist for the organization. As the lead policy staff for the organization, she advocated for the ACLU's legislative priorities at the State House, including smart criminal justice reform, equal rights for all LGBTQ Idahoans, and housing access. In addition, her lobbying work, Kathy also led successful campaigns to defeat anti-immigrant policies at the local level and educate voters through a statewide civic engagement, Let the People Vote campaign initiative. Before her policy role, she oversaw the ACLU's community outreach and volunteer programs. Kathy is a graduate from the University of Idaho, University of Oregon in 2010. I'm so sorry. with a degree in Spanish and International Studies. So welcome, Kathy. Next, we have Ruby Mendez-Mota, who is a proud daughter of immigrant parents from Mexico and raised in the Treasure Valley. Ruby currently serves as the campaign strategist for the ACLU of Idaho, which focuses on leading the ACLU's strategic issues and campaigns through legislation, education, community organizing, and leadership development. She also represents the ACLU of Idaho as a lobbyist during the Idaho legislative session. Prior to joining the ACLU of Idaho, she worked for a statewide nonprofit organization addressing and leading immigration reform, both nationally and statewide, fair lending and civic engagement campaigns. Her experience and background includes grassroots organizing, public policy, organizational strategizing, leadership development, and campaign managing. During her off-work hours, she dedicates her time as an interim co-executive director for Poder of Idaho, that works in defending immigrant rights, and a member of an all-female mariachi group, Mariachi Teotzin. Welcome.
It's a hard name.
And last but certainly not least, we have Rebecca De Leon with us today. Rebecca has lived in various parts of Idaho since she was 4 years old. She currently works as a communications manager for Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates, owns and operates Lionheart Consulting, LLC, and is part of the radio show podcast, as I mentioned earlier, the Latino Card. A former journalist, she has worked in marketing and community outreach for nearly 10 years out of Idaho. She currently lives in Meridian with her family. And let's welcome Rebecca. All right. So now that we have an understanding of who our illustrious panel is, just a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that you are all muted. So please submit questions in the chat. Our staff will be monitoring that so you can so that we make sure that we answer any of your questions. If we don't get to it, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to us still. We're happy to answer any questions and offer additional information. And yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. So I'd love to begin with an overview. JJ Saldana currently sits at the Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs as a staff person there, and they just released the 2020 Hispanic Profile Data Book, which has an incredible amount of information and data around our Latinx, Hispanic, Latino communities. And JJ, I would really love if you could share some highlights and some things that you think are important out of that report. And then if the panel could just start to discuss and think about this data and why it's important. And so I'll begin with you.
Thank you, Antonio. I'm so excited to be a part of this panel. I've been a fan of all three of these ladies for a while now. So again, I've said this before, but I fanboy out when I'm with these guys. So I want to talk about Idaho's Hispanic population, and I'm going to use the term Hispanic only because that's the government term and we're a government agency, but I do prefer to use Latinx when I'm not talking about it in a government term. So 13% of Idaho's population is Hispanic. We don't believe that's an accurate count. We believe that it's probably a little bit higher because if you go just around the state like we've traveled, you see a lot more people. We think it's more about 14 to 15%. It's heavily concentrated in the southern part of the state, but every county in Idaho has a growing Hispanic population. All 44 counties have a growing population. Idaho's Hispanic population grew 30% in the last decade, and that's compared to 12% of the overall population that's grown. So we are growing. Compared to the nation as a whole, Idaho Hispanic is more likely to be born in the United States, and that's something that a lot of people don't see or understand or want to understand. The top 5 counties are Canyon, Ada, Bonneville, Twin Falls, and Jerome counties. A relatively large share of the Idaho Hispanic population in Idaho is made up of children and young adults. So we are a very young population, and we've talked about this for years. The majority of our population is 25 years and younger. So we don't have a lot of seniors compared to our counterparts. We're a very young population. So schools are seeing our population growth way more than the general public. As of 2019, 40% of Idaho's Hispanics were under the age of 20. And so, like I said, we're a very young population. The median age among Hispanics is 25, compared to non-Hispanics is 39. So we're a very young population and very vibrant population. And so you're gonna see a big change here in the next probably 5 to 10 years when it comes across all scales. So not just the political piece, because you're going to see a lot more people voting here in the next 5 to 10 years. And what I'd like to tell politicians about that is a lot of these younger people are voting based on how politicians treated their parents and their grandparents and their remembers. So they're not just voting for their own opinions, but they're voting based on how their parents and their grandparents were. So I always tell politicians, well, if you feel okay about the way you treated, their parents or their grandparents, then you're fine. But if you think like, oh, you misstepped or you did something that, then you maybe should be worried. We have seen a lot of politicians that have done like a full 180 when their population has had significant growth, who are all of a sudden we're like, oh, no, your people don't vote, your people don't do this. And now they're coming to us like, hey, how do we reach out to your population? Because they've seen a massive growth in those, and a lot of them are in those counties that I mentioned earlier. And again, I just want to say that as of 2018, 71% of Idaho Hispanics were born in the US. And that's a stereotype that we don't have, then we should be promoting more.
Excellent. I want to ask you just
No, I think the report said there was 3% of people that work in schools that are of Hispanic descent. So we have a long way to go. We have talked with the governor about a Grow Your Own program where we bring in more bilingual, bicultural, but that's going to take funding. So we need to figure out how we can do that.
And lastly, do you mind just briefly sharing where people are working or in the workforce? Like where do we find a lot of our community members as far as the labor and workforce? Um, I also looked at this data report, so
So, well, we have a lot in the ag field, but we have a lot in the construction field as well. We're seeing a lot more business owners, Latino business owners coming in. And if you go, for example, like the city of Jerome, when I first started working at the commission, when we would travel, Jerome was kind of two towns, like when you enter, and then there was this long road, and then Jerome. Now that long road is filled with panaderias, with tiendas, with all kinds of Latino-owned businesses. So that we're seeing a lot more of that too.
so I would love to hear from each of the panelists. You have a long career and your work is taking you different places. Why is this data important? Why does this data matter?
Sure, I'll speak. I work in city government, so I'm speaking for myself personally, but with the experience also of my employer. When you're looking at government and, JJ works for the state and I work for a local city here, you want to be able to understand who is in your community and what those specific community needs are, right? And so we know that for example, in the era of COVID has disproportionately impacted Latinx community, both in terms of folks who are frontline essential workers, people who are not able to access reliable internet at home for school, parents who are still needing to work while their children are at home. And so understanding who is in our community and knowing what ways that we can provide equitable recovery within COVID, right, and meet where those services might have gaps is really important in understanding who is in your community and what services they need, but also how the structure of their community, right? Like the age group, the workforce, language access, income, all of those things matter in terms of how folks are able to recover. How are you able to get the vaccine? How are you able to balance home life and work life with your children back at school or if you're not working? And so this data is just incredibly informative in understanding what do these communities look like and what are their needs and how can we as a community and as a state respond to those services and work to make sure that their needs are being met in a way that's important and also culturally inclusive of their community as well. I'll pass it on.
For me, when I'm observing this data, for me as an organizer, it's very intriguing, right? Like where the community is growing and assessing the needs of the communities, and especially within the work that we do around civil rights, is understanding, how are those communities being represented in different spectrums, whether it be in school boards, in the city, statewide, and like what policies are passing, right? Like, is the policies passing reflective of the needs of the community? And currently it's not. And so it's really kind of demonstrating how our people that are in power are really misinterpreting this data and like really underestimating the power of our Latinx community. And like there was this term that I always would hear, like, we're the sleeping giant, but we haven't been sleeping. We've been awake this whole time. And like we have been observing, we have been analyzing, we have been organizing, we have been moving in different directions in order to start shifting. And so I would say, if anything, though the numbers may not reflective in terms of like how many people are actually registered to vote and so forth, but I think that will soon change because folks are beginning to take action now after so many years of silence, if you will.
And so going off a little bit about what Ruby was saying, our community, as JJ said, is young. And so we are very much young, energized, up and coming. And so I think that the numbers that are reflecting like the students are Latinos, but the teachers are not. Well, we're still educating future teachers. We're still working to change the landscape. And so Antonio's original question is like, why does this data matter? This data matters for many reasons, because we are very much a huge part of Idaho's culture. We are everywhere, and we are everything matters to us. We are interested in healthcare. We are interested in education. We're interested in politics. We're interested, we have buying power. We have political power, and we are a huge part of the community. We're forced to be dealt with, and we are very much up and coming, and we've been doing the work, and we will continue doing the work. And this data matters because that showcases um, how we are finding our own way in Idaho. And it also matters because when you have a state and you have a lot of different people with a lot of different needs, you need to know who needs what in order to distribute the resources and the funding well. And so something that has been a huge problem, over decades and decades is that community organizers, nonprofit organizations, all of these kinds of entities that work to build the community are always chronically underfunded when they serve Hispanic, Latino, Black, Indigenous communities. They are always underfunded. And so this data is the proof that we need, essentially, to say statistically, we are here, we matter, these are the kinds of resources that we need, and this is what we deserve. And so when we're trying to figure out kind of like the landscape and what we're doing, a lot of the times, especially in Idaho, we're very much like the pull yourself out by your bootstraps type. A lot of times people will tell us, the Latinx community, that, okay, well, you have access to education, you have access to things. And what they don't fully understand is that we don't walk this state the same way that our non-Latino counterparts do. We are not treated the same way. We do not need the same resources in the same way. We need different resources in different ways. And you cannot uh, you cannot accurately portray what that is, what that means, and what that says without this kind of extremely important data, because this data does show where we are, what we need, and where we're going.
Thank you all so much for sharing those really important points. And we're going to pass the mic all the way back to JJ for this one, and we're going to come back again. And I think that this is a really good flow. I really like how we thought about this beforehand as far as like placement of seating. um, I would really love, so we talked about data, right? And we have some data, and JJ, I think you are most apt to speak about this specifically because each released this data. What are we missing? And for the rest of the panel, also, what are the barriers, right, to getting this data? Um, yeah, if we could start with JJ down the end there.
Thank you. We're missing a lot of data. To get stuff based just on ethnicity is a pain because like some schools don't release things based on ethnicity, and they say it's a privacy issue, so we can't do that. So when we first spoke with the authors of this, they're like, what do you mean you can't get this data on ethnicity? And they're like, you just don't know how to get it. And then they tried and they're like, oh, you're right. So I'm like, we told you. So a lot of people, like, for example, Secretary of State has told us, we don't collect, information based on the ethnicity because we don't have to legally, we don't have to, so we don't. And so I think, why don't you? There's all the other states are doing it. Why isn't Idaho collecting that data? So we need to put pressure on the Secretary of State to say, hey, you should collect this data because it's important that we have this data. So education and then in civics, we need to be collecting more data. It's important because then we know. So for example, the Hispanic buying power, we wouldn't know that unless that data was collected. And the Hispanic buying power is huge here in Idaho. We outspend our counterparts on food, clothes, electronics. So we like to eat, we like to look good, and we're on top of everything. So we outspend everybody. So it's very important that we have this data. It's very important that we have people that put it out there. And when they say we don't have to do it, or when they say we just don't collect it by ethnicity, that's just a lazy excuse.
Antonio, can you repeat the question?
What are the barriers, right? Because we're asking people for
Mm.
data as well. And so I'd
Mhm.
love for you to also just speak on that if you want to, and also what we're missing, if there's something specific that you think we're missing.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of barriers, JJ like really kind of spelled it out, right? Like we're lacking a lot of data. So I think in a lot of ways that lack of data only further ingrains, policymakers and decision makers that this is not a constituency that really rises to the level of specific focus when it comes to policy making, right? Like having specific education outcomes, having specific, well, education is a really big one, right? Like not only young people like in our public schools, but also how we're making sure that folks are able to go on to higher degree learning if they want to go into trade school, right? Like where are folks moving into the workforce after they graduate from Idaho public school systems? And I think it just really, when you forget and don't really understand or fully comprehend the extent to which the Latinx community is really just a predominant force all across the state, specifically here in southwestern Idaho, but really there are folks all over North Idaho, East Idaho, everywhere. You fail to include those communities in policy making, right? Like COVID is a great example of how much that community was left out, right? Like now we know with this new federal relief program, the Paycheck Protection program, allows for undocumented business owners to be able to access this relief money, and they were blocked from being able to access money. There's so much tax money that comes in from the immigrant community, whether they're documented or undocumented. And so to not have that lens or that focus when you're sitting down at the table with decision makers to make policy decisions, whether you intend to or you don't, and likely in many cases you do intend to, you are excluding this community that just brings so much to the table. And you got to be able to collect that with culturally inclusive programs, language access, meeting folks where they are, and really hiring folks from that community to do that work, because that's how you're going to get the best results in building trust and building awareness. So that's kind of where my head goes to when you repeat the question for me so I can answer.
I think for me, it's like the barriers is like we just live in a system that was not built for us. Period. It's for white people. Period. That's what it is. And so when we think about like hiring individuals, like are you hiring them and are you paying them well? Right? Like let's be real. A lot of people want to hire Latinx leaders, but are you paying them equally and fairly enough for their expertise? And I was also understanding they do not represent the whole community as a whole. And so not putting that burden on local leaders to be able to solve the problem. There are so many folks with so many talents in different areas of the state that are able to provide different kinds of expertise, knowledge, and understanding of how their community works, what resonates the most, not only culturally, but also like language, because Spanish is not the only language that folks speak. And so being able to understand like we are very diverse, we're not all Mexican and so like we all come from different parts of South America, Central America, and even within Mexico there's just so much culture difference, right, culturally. And so being able to understand and have individuals, and it's not like reading a book, it's like being intentionally, like what are you intentionally doing to start changing the habits of your bias against or for the Latinx community. And when we start doing that, we start shifting culture, and we start being more understanding of what the needs and the things that we are asking as a community as well. And so when that comes, then there comes accountability. And so when you hear us say something that we're calling you out on, it's us holding you accountable for it, not because of other reasons that you may think of because of your biases.
Yeah, I think all of those answers were very much hit the nail on the head. One thing that I also want to mention that is missing from this data is that which is invisible. That's what you can't measure, which is like how racism in Idaho affects our communities. You can't really measure that. Well, you can kind of, but there's so much in Idaho that tells our communities that we are not wanted, that we are not valued, and that we don't belong here, essentially. And so we receive those messages from all over the place when they pass legislation to ban critical race theory. That has a very deep mental impact to us when we can see the racism around us, and then we are being told that doesn't exist and you're not allowed to talk about it, especially in school, and you're not allowed to talk about how we got here, because it's not important, and or you're not important. That is the message that we're receiving. That's the message that we receive everywhere. If we were to go to the grocery store and start speaking Spanish because we can, we get looks, we get, things, we get stares, we get people who treat us differently as a result. You can't measure that in this data. And so, you know, it is very much along the line of like the comment that I had made earlier, is like, we are constantly from every direction being told that we matter less, that we're, second class citizens, even if we are US citizens, and that our perspective doesn't matter, and that our perspective is wrong. Like, we are gaslighting an entire community inside of Idaho, telling us you aren't actually seeing what you see, and there is no racism here, and we're not being racist toward you. And we're saying, yes, we can see it. We can see it everywhere. We can see it in the disparities in education. We can see it in the disparities in income. And we are hardworking, we're intelligent, we're resilient, and we are out here trying to fight for our place at these tables, at these very important tables. And that's the kind of data that you can't get. So when we're talking about this report, takes a ton of resources. It's very in-depth. It has a ton of incredible data. This isn't free to produce. And I don't know if I'm allowed to speak for anybody, but I know that finding the kind of resources and funding to get something like this out there, to get it produced and to get it done, is extremely difficult, because Idaho has over and over and over told us we're not worth it. We're not worth those kinds of resources, that there are other people who need those resources more, that we're always last in line. And so what's missing is everything that you cannot see in between the lines, which is even just getting this report out is a fight. It's a struggle. Getting people to value the report is a fight, is a struggle. And then just having to be able to walk around in Idaho, being our full selves, bringing our full selves to a workplace that might be hostile toward Latinos. Like, this is all things that you cannot measure. And it is all things that absolutely need to be taken into account, because the mental health and the ability for people to move on with themselves is very much also defined by what opportunities are open to them and what doors are slammed in their faces. And you can't precisely always measure that.
Well, I just want to mention thing that I forgot to mention earlier is, in the education system, we have the one person in, because I've been traveling for the last few months to all these different school districts, and they have that one person that's the Latinx person that does everything, that has to do the translating, that has to do the taking all the calls, that has to do all the parent teacher conferences, and they're wearing these people out because they have one person, and that person has to go to every school, and the low pay that they give that person is, so the person is extremely dedicated, but you're wearing these people out by having them do everything in town, because it's that one person that the parent knows that they can call. And then they're expected to do all the translating, all the interpreting. They're expected to do quite a bit. So we have like that one person. And so every time we go and visit with these people in all these different communities, they're telling us that they're burned out, that they don't know what else to do. And then on top of that, they have the principal or their director telling them, you're spending a little too much time on the translating. We need you to spend less time. And it's like, but you're giving me all these documents to translate. And so we also need to make sure that we're taking care of these folks, because we're going to lose them. And they're hardworking, dedicated people that really do care about the students and the parents in that community.
I have a bonus question that I think everybody's going to want to answer. So I just want to ask it in the microphone. So we had a different question, but based on what I'm hearing from the conversation, I'd really like to ask this question sort of point blank. What is needed for there to be trust between our Latinx communities and the broader Idaho population?
Pass it to JJ.
I think we also had another technical issue earlier. The camera was not on when you were introducing everyone. So if we could just go through really quick and everybody say your name.
Oh, sure.
Sounds like we're back.
Okay.
So start where? Okay, so I'm JJ Saldana, and I'm with the Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs.
I'm Kathy Griesmyer, and I'm the Government Affairs Director for a city here in Idaho.
I'm Ruby Mendez-Mota, and I am with the ACLU of Idaho as the campaign strategist.
And it's okay. And I'm Rebecca De Leon, and I am with Planned Parenthood.
Everybody knows me by now.
So we were talking about building trust amongst Latinos and non-Latinos, and I say that we still have a long way to go. There's local leaders all across the state that have built that trust with the community. A lot of them, like I said, are the migrant education coordinators or the EL coordinators, the English language learners coordinators. But sometimes it's those DJs, the radio DJs in those small communities. And that's something that we also need to focus on. Instead of asking them to continue to give us free PR, we need to pay them because they're struggling to stay afloat already. And so that's one thing that we did during COVID was we kept sending stuff over there, but we're like, we need to support them. We can't ask them to continue to give stuff for free because they themselves also need to make a living. But building trust is going to be really hard, I think, especially when you have a legislative session like we had this year. Are you really going to trust your legislator? And I guess that varies from district to district, but you have to see like when they're saying certain things, do they really value you as, you know, one of their constituents? So I think we have a lot of work to do when it comes to building that trust.
Thank you, JJ. I would say building relationships takes time, but don't be transactional about it, right? Like folks come in and come out when they have a program goal or a fundraising goal or whatever it might be. And this community notices, right? We are asked to do a lot of things for a lot of people without much return. So I think really, if you truly want to build trust, you got to start with a foundation, and that's knowing who are the leaders in your community, paying them the respect that they deserve for the work that they do to lead their communities and work to build authentic relationships. And that includes paying them for services, hiring them. If you want to do outreach in your organization, hire somebody who is a member of that community and pay them what you would pay your non-Latinx organizers, right? Like pay equity, benefits, making sure that you're giving them the resources that they need to equitably serve their communities. I think those are just some small steps that folks can take that people notice and will go a long way, but don't be transactional, and pay equity is a really big deal.
There was mention of like building relationships, and yeah, absolutely, relationship is one. But I think also adding on to that is like, what are you doing for the community, right? For folks that are in these positions, whether city, state level, like, are you thinking about the Latinx community when you're making policy? Are you thinking about the undocumented community, right? So like, if you want to build trust, start passing things that actually benefit the community. Driver's licenses for our undocumented community, scholarships for our DACA students, though, or just simply supporting statewide. Like right now we have the Farm Worker Modernization Act, the DREAM Act, the Promise Act, like these things that nationwide that's happening, like our state officials can do something about it, can put pressure. And so if you really want to gain trust, then start passing policies that actually matter to us, and have Black and brown bodies represented in these spaces too.
And so I think that everything that everybody said is very much on the dot, and I don't have too much to add to it, except to say that, you know, a lot of people, when they want to build trust with our community, they don't even know where to start. You know, like, what can I do? I'm only so and so who works, you know, I'm not even the head of a company. What can I specifically do? And I think sort of like on a micro level, it feels like it's not a lot to ask, but it is a lot to ask. Just be respectful. Be respectful to us. Like, don't intentionally mispronounce our names. Don't, you know, it's just all of these little things that um, add up over and over and over again. And I think also one thing that we didn't mention was that our communities are mad. We're like pissed. We're sick of it. We're sick of being treated this way. And all we want is a little bit of respect. We're not asking for more than the next person. We're just asking for equality. We're just asking for a little bit of respect. And so that's a really good place to start. And not passing terrible legislation against us is a good way. Paying us for our time is a good way, and don't expect us to be grateful for crumbs. That's how we are always treated. It's like, oh, yeah, well, I am asking you to go above and beyond your job duties to translate this into Spanish for us, but you should be grateful that I allow you to do that. No, we're not grateful. Be respectful, treat us equally.
Thank you so much for all of your insight and sharing your thoughts. Um, so this question goes a little bit more, definitely in the same line of what we're speaking, what we've been talking about, but specifically, what is the relationship between that you've noticed between our communities and our local government? So not thinking necessarily statewide, right, at the federal level, but more at the local level with cities and counties. And so if JJ, you'd like to start us off.
Well, I think we need to, for me, I just immediately went to the policing piece of it. And again, I just came back from traveling all last week in different communities. And I had one sheriff just say, my problems are with the Latinos and the Indian kids. And that was like the very first thing he said before we even sat down. So that just tells me that there's a lot of education that needs to happen in that county. For a sheriff to just flat out say that was kind of concerning to my director and I, because again, we had just walked into the office. We hadn't even sat down when he said that. So that was the introduction. And so there is, a need. I like that here in Boise, there's, he has an advisory council that I sit a part of, and he goes out, and then I'm talking about the previous chief because this new chief came in during the pandemic, but the previous chief would go out and do, coffee with the cop. He would go to the panaderias and he'd go to the tiendas and do that. And he offered Spanish classes to all staff so they could, it was a Band-Aid approach, but it was more like just conversational Spanish. So they could get to the point where they're like, okay, somebody will be with you shortly. Please don't panic or whatever the situation is. But then we go to other counties where it's not the case and they say stuff like, these are our problems. Instead of saying we're working to resolve this or this issue. We are hosting a law enforcement summit in Idaho Falls next week, and it's about implicit bias. It's our second one that we're doing. But getting sheriffs to sign up for this has been very, very difficult. A lot of them are like, oh, no, we already know. And it's like, do you? Because, statistics show us different things. And so, we have chiefs of police that are signing up, but the sheriff's offices are not signing up. And so that's very alarming to us.
I think I'll speak to a time when I was in my previous role at the ACLU, was working on a campaign at the time with the county and city of Jerome. They were working to bring in an ICE contract, immigrations and custom enforcement contract with their local jail as a way to pay off their jail bond, to make money and pay off this investment that they had made in their community. And, really that disconnect between what a decision like that would mean for a community like Jerome, which is predominantly farm worker, agricultural. You have mixed status families. So you have some folks with citizenship, some folks who are undocumented, some folks with maybe legal residence. And it rightfully so created terror in that community. And, thinking back to Ruby's point about like the sleeping giant, the community showed up to tell their local officials what the concerns were and to really, I think, hit home. Like, this was not a thought through decision where you were centering what this predominant community group in a community like Jerome, which is the backbone of this agricultural community, what this would mean for them. And I mean, we had JJ and I were there. We had 600 folks show up to a county commissioners meeting one day, folks parading down the street, showing up. And I think just reminding local government, right? Like, what might seem like a one item issue is multifaceted when you're really thinking about who is in your community, what roles do they serve, and how does that impact families? How does that impact your economy? I mean, we were organizing at churches. I mean, we were organizing at tiendas. We were going to where they have the bailes, um, really working to help folks understand what was going on. I mean, folks understood, but right, how do you participate in process? And then really making sure local government officials understood. And thankfully, that proposal died. I would think that they would think a whole lot about trying to reintroduce that again, but really shows a disconnect, I think, between decision makers and who's in their community.
And that's a really good example. Kathy did a fantastic job at getting people there. I mean, the halls of that courthouse were packed. The courtroom itself was packed, and then people on the parking lot were packed. It changed the sheriff's mind that day. He told my directors, like, well, I'll go either way, whatever you guys decide. But my favorite part was, one of the county commissioners who was voting for it had one of the people come in. He's like, I rent a house from you. And that was part of her testimony. She's like, who's going to rent your houses if you get rid of all this community? And that was like, you saw the light bulb right there. And when she's like, whoa, wait, that's going to affect me financially too. And that was the only reason I think that she changed her mind, was because it was going to hit her financially.
Power of organizing and the power has shifted. I love it. And so, gosh, remind me the question again, because I'm just like so intrigued right now.
The relationship between our Latinx communities and our local government.
Oh yeah. Geez, where do I start? There's so much. Yes to everything JJ and Kathy shared. And also I would add on to it is um recognizing that there is definitely like racial implications to the systems created, right? Like stop over policing our community, stop arresting and putting into jail and prisons our community. We're a huge population represented in that in itself. And like it comes back to a meeting that we were in earlier this year, and we presented to lawmakers and certain commissioners and representatives around the criminal legal work, and them not acknowledging that was frustrating. And so, like, what can we do to hold them accountable? Like, I don't know, that's still a conversation happening, right? But I think the examples that were provided is that when you poke at us, we'll poke back and even harder. And so we're organizing, we are mobilizing, and like I said, we're not sleeping, we're watching, we're observing, and we're organizing, and we're getting ready. And when you least remember it, like we're going to be in these positions of power. Like we're going to be calling the shots, and we're going to be holding those folks accountable. And like, trust me, we do remember who made certain decisions, and like who was working with who, and like what were you advocating for. And so it's just kind of like, just be ready. That's all I have to say.
Yes to all of that. And then I think it would be appropriate to sort of tie all of that up with a call to our own people and our own community, like run for office. We have no representation in these, and it's because we are intimidated from running for office. It's another one that goes back to like the very clear message of like, you don't belong here, you don't belong at these tables. We don't need your representation. We don't need your community to make our rules. And that is in both the current makeup of our elected officials, but it's also in the way that we see the very few Latinx elected officials who are in these kinds of positions, the way that they're treated, and they are treated differently. They are, they do get a lot of racist things. They do get a lot of, racist threats and just treatment that is, again, easily dismissed on an individual level as just like, oh, well, this is because of this, and you can explain it away. But it all adds up into these microaggressions where it's very clearly the same message that is being sent out of like, you don't belong here, we don't like you here, we don't need you here. And yet at the same time, if you're not there, they will pass terrible, terrible legislation against your community. And so it's twofold. Two things need to happen. We need to make, as Idaho non-Latinos, y'all need to make this a lot more and a lot more welcoming and a lot more accessible for us by being less toxic. And to our people, we need to step up and we need to take those positions forward, and we need to make our community voices heard at the tables where they need to be heard at. And that is across all levels of local government, from school boards to police accountability boards to city council, all over the place. We need to have representation everywhere because it does make a difference.
Thank you all so much. For the folks who are still with us and listening, I just really want to say that I've had the privilege and pleasure to work with each one of you. And what we've been able to accomplish in the last few years as far as the voting rights program is that we have seen an increase of folks voting, but that's because JJ, I used the data from the Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs.
Okay, because since I met Antonio, I put him to work almost from that day. I'm like, this community needs this. So I've been putting him to work.
The ACLU of Idaho and these lovely ladies, we collaborated on materials before and translation and getting that out to our community members. Rebecca with the Latino Card, we were able to speak on the census, and all this incredible work has moved the needle, even if it, is, when we look at the data, it's 5%, it's 15% when it's municipal elections, but just that investment we've seen folks start to get way more interested in voting. Like, the conversations that we've been having with people have been really incredible. And that's partially why I wanted to invite all of you here, because I think for a lot of people, when we go out and explain our work, it becomes a little bit hard because we're not a monolith. And there's so many different perspectives, and there's so much still that we have to invest in to really get a clear picture of how we can create a democracy that actually works for everybody here in Idaho. When we have so many folks who are choosing not to vote or aren't informed on when an election is happening. We spoke a lot about translations, a lot about building trust, and each of these components, I think, fits in this sort of design of how we can actually create something that feels welcoming for folks. It's not just translate, these election materials. It's not just make ballots in Spanish. It's a really comprehensive and long-term approach to building that. And so I just wanted to share that in case folks had questions on, our connection as CVI to all of these panelists here. And so with that, we'll take your questions. Hopefully ones that we haven't answered already live, which might be a bit of a challenge.
Can I real quick? Just in case anyone was wondering, the reason why we're all in person is because we are all fully vaccinated. We discussed this beforehand. It was a big decision to be in person, unmasked, but we are all fully vaccinated. Just wanted everyone to know that.
Thank you. Things I don't think about sometimes. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Not yet. We still got a few people listening in, so give everyone a minute to submit any questions they have.
Yeah, I've definitely been on the other side of these types of webinars, and it's sometimes, very difficult to come up with a question. Am I seeing something in the window here?
Yes, so we have a question from Julia. She asks, speaking of vaccination, is the Latinx community conflicted on that?
Ooh, good question. Let me start.
Yes, we'll start over here.
I got this. Yes, they are. And it goes back to kind of like that system on top of system on top of system, leaving the Latinx community out. when COVID hit initially, the information that was given to non-Latinos, specifically in English only, was widely disseminated. You could find thousands of articles at any given moment, and there was virtually nothing in Spanish. Specifically, there was nothing in Spanish that was local. And so our community was hit harder by COVID for many reasons. One, they didn't know what was happening. Two, they typically have more barriers to healthcare access. Three, they themselves just they culturally they have a different approach to medicine. There are so many things, because it has to be bilingual, it has to be bicultural, and you have to really speak to our communities. And so it's the exact same thing that we're seeing with the vaccination rollout. They don't know what it is, they don't know where it came from, there's no information for them, they don't know how to feel about it, they don't know, they just got used to putting on masks and I guess changing their businesses to be socially distant and all of that. And now they're like, wait, now do we have to wear masks? Do we get vaccinated? Is it safe? Are we supposed to get it? Are we allowed to get it? What if we're undocumented? They have all these questions and, there's not a lot of answers that are readily available for them. So it's just kind of the same, system upon a system that is letting them down. So yes, and I think that, it's up to people like us, to try and help get that information out there, get accurate information out there. There's also a lot of misinformation in Spanish as well. And so there are a lot of barriers to that that are just really indicative of what we have been talking about.
So another question we have is, what are the funding needs that y'all are seeing coming up?
All of
Yeah.
everything. Everything. I mean, like, please, the state needs to fund more ICHA. Period. They need to fund ICHA, and we need people to start donating to local nonprofits that are doing the on the ground work. Right? There's so many community based local nonprofits, whether 501c3 or not, like they are doing the work. They're in their communities. They know what's going on, and so we just need more of that funding towards those communities. And I don't know if anyone else has.
I'll talk about, just for example, like the report that we just put out, we couldn't afford to go with our usual statistician, so we had to contract out. But even with that, we had to find sponsors. So the Idaho Dairymen's Association, Idaho National Laboratories came on board and sponsored that report. We couldn't afford to do it without it. And so because we want to give out accurate and top-notch data, but we can't afford those statisticians without those sponsors. So, we do need a lot more funding for that. So you can go to our website and there's a banner as soon as you click on our website, and it's icha.idaho.gov. And there's a banner flying right on top of the governor's forehead that you can click on, and it'll give you that report. It's about 180 pages, so it's a good couple hour read.
Highly recommend.
I think that is all the questions we have for now.
All right, so if it's okay, I can do the closing. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time. Also, our panelists here, each of them taking an hour of their day to come speak with us and do this webinar. We invite you to join us for the rest of the Green Tie festivities. You can view the whole schedule at idaho.org/green tie/learn. But you can just check out our main website, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it there. And that link will be posted in the chat. You can also bid on any of the great items that we have on our online auction. A link to that auction is also available in the chat. Finally, Green Tie is our annual fundraiser. So if you want to support CVA's work for Idaho, consider making a gift, please. Our work is made possible by folks, donors, Idahoans like you, folks who care so much about preserving our clean air, clean water, and the folks who enjoy these natural spaces that we get to live in. And I want to thank anyone who's already made a gift. Extra kudos to you. Green Tie thanks to a generous donor as well. So all gifts will be matched dollar for dollar up to $25,000 in total if you make a gift today. So definitely some incentive there. You can use the link in the chat to make a Green Tie gift. We also encourage you to share any and all of these resources with other folks you know who might be interested in our work. and follow us on social media for updates on our work and news on issues. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today.